It is nearly midnight in the harbor, and you are standing at the rail of the most powerful warship your country has ever owned. She is brand new. She still smells of fresh paint and machine oil, and the cold British steel she was built from on the far side of the ocean, for a fortune your poor country could barely afford. Beneath your bare feet the deck is enormous, a floating gray island, and above you the great guns sit in their turrets like sleeping animals, each barrel long enough to throw a shell the weight of a man clear across the bay. And in front of you, across the black water of Guanabara Bay, the lights of Rio de Janeiro are burning the cafes, the palaces, the government offices, the capital of the whole republic, laid out along the shore like a string of jewels. Your back hurts. It hurts because of what was done to it, and to the backs of the men standing silent beside you in the dark. And you are all thinking the same impossible thought at the same time. You have the guns now, not the officers, you, the men who were whipped, and those guns are pointed right now at the city of the men who whipped you. A decision has already been made. There is no going back from it. In a few hours the sun will come up over the bay, and Brazil will wake to find that its own navy, its newest, proudest, most expensive warships, have been taken by the very sailors the country had spent 400 years teaching to obey. And those sailors are about to make one single, breathtaking demand. Let me tell you how they got here and what they wanted and what it cost them, because this is one of the bravest and most shameful things that ever happened in my country, and hardly anyone tells it. Pull up a chair and let me pour us both something, because this one takes a while and it takes a steady hand. My name is Joaquim. For the better part of 40 years I stood in front of Brazilian schoolchildren with a piece of chalk in my hand, trying to teach them that the past is not a tidy parade of heroes on horseback, but a crowded room full of real people, frightened, furious, hopeful people, no less real than you or me. I am mostly retired now, though a teacher never truly retires. We just run out of students and start talking to whoever will sit still. And of all the stories I ever taught, this is the one I could never get through without my voice catching somewhere in the middle. It has a hero in it, a real one, a man whose name you have almost certainly never heard. And by the end of this, you are going to wonder how on earth that is possible. I am going to be honest with you the whole way through, honest about the courage and honest about the betrayal, and honest that in some places the historians still argue about the exact numbers, and where they argue I will tell you so. That is the deal I make with a story like this. It deserves the truth. So, let us begin with a wound that was 400 years in the making. To understand what those men on the battleship wanted, you have to understand the country standing behind them, and to understand the country, you have to start with a date. 1888. In 1888, Brazil abolished slavery. And I want you to sit with that date for a moment, because it is later than you think. It is later than almost anyone thinks. Brazil was the last country in the entire Western world, the last nation in all of the Americas to end the enslavement of human beings. Not one of the last. The last. While other countries had fought wars over it and moved on, Brazil kept the system running decade after decade, right up to the edge of the 20th century. For nearly 400 years, my country had imported and enslaved more African men, women, and children than any other place on the face of the earth. The numbers are staggering, the suffering beyond my power to describe to you in a way that does it justice. And then in 1888, with the stroke of a pen on a law we call the Lei Aurea, the Golden Law, it was over. On paper. On paper. Hold on to those two words, because this whole story lives inside them. Because here is the question the schoolbook likes to skip, and it is the most important question of all. What happens the day after? When a country ends slavery on a Tuesday, what happens on Wednesday to the millions of people who were enslaved on Monday? There is no land waiting for them, no wages saved up, no schools, no apology, no plan. There is a signature on a law, and then there is the rest of your life, in a society built from the ground up on the idea that people who looked like you existed to be commanded and beaten and used. The chains came off, but the country that had forged them was still standing, and it did not change its mind about you overnight just because a princess had signed a paper. That, my friend, is the shadow our sailors were born into. Just 22 years later, now let us go down to the sea, because that is where this story is set, and let us look honestly at who was on those ships. Brazil in 1910 had a shiny new navy and a very old habit. The officers, the men in the fine white uniforms, the captains and the admirals, the ones who gave the orders and dined at the good tables, were overwhelmingly white, well-born, educated men from the families that had always run Brazil, and the ordinary sailors, the enlisted men, the ones who scrubbed the decks and hauled the coal and loaded the guns and did every hard and filthy thing that makes a warship move. They were overwhelmingly black and mixed-race men, poor men. Many of them, and this is the heart of it, were the sons and the grandsons of the enslaved. Some had been born into slavery themselves in their earliest years before the law changed. They had been swept into the Navy through poverty and coercion, some little more than boys, and once inside, they found themselves living a life that would have been grimly, horribly familiar to their own grandparents, because the Navy still used the whip, the lash. In Portuguese, the chibata, a word that in Brazil to this day carries the weight of this entire story. When a sailor broke a rule, when he was insolent, when he was drunk, when an officer simply decided he needed correcting, he could be stripped and tied and flogged in front of the assembled crew with a whip. In the 20th century, on a modern warship bristling with electricity and steel and the newest technology money could buy, the nation had officially abolished slavery, had declared all men free and equal, had proclaimed itself a proud modern republic, and then it sent the grandsons of slaves out to sea, and it whipped them like slaves. And here is the detail I need you to hold, the one that turns a hardship into an injustice. The lash was not for everyone. An officer who failed in his duty was not stripped and flogged before the crew. That was unthinkable. He might be reprimanded, confined, dismissed, punished as a gentleman is punished. The whip was reserved in practice for the enlisted men, for the black and mixed-race men at the bottom, the same men, the same backs. It was slavery's exact instrument, kept alive and pointed at exactly the same people, 2 decades after slavery was supposed to be dead. A student of mine once asked me, very quietly from the back of the room, "Professor, did they not see it? Did the officers truly not see what they were doing?" And I have thought about that question for 30 years. I think the terrible answer is that they saw nothing at all. To them it was simply discipline, simply the way the world was arranged. And that blindness is its own kind of horror, so the fury was there already. It was in the wood of the ships. It had been building for years, a pressure with no way out, in the chests of thousands of men who had learned to keep their faces still while their hearts screamed. All it needed was a spark. And in November of 1910, on a warship in Guanabara Bay, the spark came and it had a name. His name was Marcelino Rodriguez Menezes. He was a sailor like the others, and for an offense aboard ship, he was sentenced to be flogged, not a handful of strokes, but a savage extravagant, near-murderous punishment. The number most often reported is around 250 lashes. And here I must stop and keep my promise to you, because accuracy is sacred to me even when a smaller number would still be monstrous. The exact figure is disputed by historians. The sources do not all agree, and you should be suspicious of anyone who gives you a whip count to the last stroke a century later. But whether it was 250 or something near it, understand what that means. That is not discipline. No human back survives that as a lesson. That is a flogging meant to break a man in body and in spirit in front of his comrades, so that every other man watching would learn to be afraid. And they made the others watch. That was the point of it. It was always the point. The whipping was a performance, a ritual of power, staged on the deck for an audience of men who were forbidden to move, forbidden to speak, forbidden even to let their faces show what they felt. Imagine standing in that silence. Imagine watching a man you know, a man who eats beside you and sleeps beside you, torn apart stroke by bloody stroke, and knowing that any one of the men standing next to you in that line could be next, and that there is nothing you are allowed to do but stand and watch and count. Except that this time, something in the men did not break the way it was supposed to. This time, in the silence, a decision was being made. Marcelino's blood on that deck was not going to buy the officers' obedience. It was going to buy them a revolt. Now the story gives us its hero, and I have been waiting to introduce him to you because I love him, and by the end I hope you will too. His name was Joao Candido Felisberto. He was a sailor, an experienced one, a helmsman, a man who knew the ships and knew the men. He was black, the descendant of enslaved people, born in the far south of Brazil. And by every account that survives, he had something that cannot be taught and cannot be faked, the thing that makes some men into leaders in the exact moment when leadership means the gallows. He was calm, he was disciplined, he was intelligent, and he was steady. And when the fury of thousands of desperate men needed a cool head to give it a shape and a purpose, it was Joao Candido the men turned to. Because here is what lifts this above a simple explosion of rage, and it is the part that gives me chills every single time. This was not a mob. This was not men losing control. This was, in its own way, one of the most disciplined actions in the whole history of Brazil. For weeks, quietly in the dark corners of the ships, the sailors had been organizing. They had leaders. They had a plan. They had decided together exactly what they were going to seize and exactly what they were going to demand and exactly what they would not do. And what they would not do is the thing that breaks my heart with admiration. They agreed, these men who had every reason on earth to want blood, that this was not about revenge. It was about ending the whip. Full stop. They were not going to sack the city. They were not going to loot or rampage or repay 400 years of cruelty in a single red night. They were going to take the guns and point them and make one demand, as men, not as animals, which is what they had been treated as, but as men. So on the night of the 22nd of November, 1910, they did it. The sailors rose on the great ships of the fleet, above all on the two brand-new dreadnought battleships, the pride of the entire nation, named the Minas Geraes and the Sao Paulo. You have to understand what these ships were to Brazil. They were the most modern, most powerful, most expensive warships in the world at that moment. Genuinely, for a brief window, among the mightiest vessels afloat anywhere. Brazil, a poor country, had bought them from the British at staggering cost to buy itself a seat at the table of great nations, to say to the world, look, we are modern, we are strong, we matter. They were the nation's pride made of steel. And in a single night, The men at the bottom, the whipped men, the sons of the enslaved, took them. There was violence in the seizing of the ships. A handful of officers who resisted were killed in those first hours, and I will not pretend otherwise, because a story you sand the edges off is a lie. But once the ships were theirs, the astonishing discipline held. The sailors did not descend into slaughter. They organized themselves. They kept the great engines running, kept the mighty guns manned and ready, kept order aboard, and they raised their signal. Joao Candido took command of the fleet, a black enlisted sailor, in command of the most powerful warships his nation possessed, steaming in slow, deliberate circles in the bay. And when the sun came up over Guanabara Bay on the morning of the 23rd, the city of Rio de Janeiro woke to a sight out of a fever dream. Its own navy, its own beautiful, ruinously expensive battleships, turned around. The great guns, the guns built to defend the capital, traversed slowly inward and pointed at the capital, at the palaces, at the government, at the homes of the very men who had ordered the whip. And now the sailors sent their message ashore to the President and the Congress of Brazil, and I want you to hear how astonishing it is. They did not demand money. They did not demand power or land or the heads of their officers or the overthrow of the Republic. They had the single most powerful weapon in the country in their hands. They could have flattened whole districts of the capital, and with that unimaginable leverage they asked for one thing. In the Lash, abolish corporal punishment in the Navy of Brazil. Stop whipping us. Treat us as men, as citizens, as sailors of a free republic and not as slaves. That was the demand. Along with it they asked for amnesty, a promise that they would not be punished for the rising and for some improvements to the brutal conditions of their service. But the beating heart of it, the thing the whole revolt was named forever after, was the Chibata, the whip. They aimed the mightiest guns in South America at their own capital city, and they used all that terrible power to ask simply to stop being beaten. I have taught a great many demands from a great many rebellions in my life. I am not sure I have ever taught one more modest or more damning. Because think about what it says about the country. To ask that grown men in the 20th century not be flogged like animals, and to have to seize battleships to be heard. The smallness of the request is the loudest possible indictment of the nation that made it necessary. And now comes the turn in this story that nobody expects, the part that makes people sit up when I tell it, because we all know deep down how these stories are supposed to go. The powerless rise up. They have their brief brave moment, and then the powerful crush them. That is the shape we expect. That is the shape history usually delivers. That is not what happened here. Not at first. Because the government looked out from the shore, and it saw the guns of the Minas Geraes and the Sao Paulo pointed at the city, and it did the arithmetic. Those ships could reduce the waterfront of Rio de Janeiro to rubble. The men aboard were disciplined, organized, and utterly resolved, and they had shown they knew how to work the guns. The president, a man named Hermes da Fonseca, himself an old soldier, a marshal, and the Congress of Brazil faced a choice that no amount of pride could wriggle out of. Fight and watch their own beautiful navy shell their own beautiful capital, or give in. They gave in. The Congress of Brazil voted to abolish the lash in the Navy. They voted to grant the sailors amnesty. The whip, that ancient, filthy, cruel instrument, that living relic of slavery, was, by the decision of the national legislature, with battleship guns trained on the building, to be ended. The sailors had won. Do you understand what I am telling you? They had won. A handful of poor, black, whipped enlisted men, the very bottom of the whole social order, the grandsons of the enslaved, had faced down the entire armed might of the Brazilian state and forced it to bend. They had taken the most powerful weapons in the country, and without firing them in anger on the city, had won a change in the law of the land. The people of Rio, many of them, cheered, and Joao Candido, the calm helmsman, the black sailor who had held it all together, became, in the mouths of the people, a legend with a name that still gives me a shiver to say. They called him the Almirante Negro, the Black Admiral. Stand there with them for a moment, on the deck of the Minas Geraes in the sunshine, with the news coming out from the shore that the whip is finished, that you are pardoned, that you have not only survived but triumphed. Feel it, because I want you to feel exactly how high they were standing when the ground was pulled out from under them. They lowered their flag. They gave up the ships, trusting the amnesty, trusting the promise of a grateful republic that had just met their demand. The sailors stood down and handed back the battleships and returned, unarmed, to being ordinary men of the fleet. They had asked to be treated as men who could be trusted, and now they extended that same trust to the government. And the government betrayed them. Within days, the whip had been abolished, yes, the law had passed and it stood, but the men who had forced it, the state had no intention of letting them live. Once the guns were back in loyal hands, once the danger had passed, the mood ashore curdled. Fear turned into a hunger for revenge. A state of siege was declared, and the promise of amnesty so recently given was quietly, coldly, shamefully broken. The reprisals came down. Sailors were seized. Men were discharged from the Navy, expelled, cast out. Many were arrested, hunted as mutineers despite the pardon they had been promised. Some were shipped off to the far edges of the country, to labor and to die in the disease-ridden depths of the Amazon. And some, and here we come to the part I can barely teach without stopping, some of the imprisoned men were thrown into a cell on a small island in the very bay they had ruled just days before, an island called Ilha das Cobras, Snake Island. They were crowded into a punishment cell there, packed in together in the tropical heat, without air enough to breathe, without water enough to drink. And in that cell, in appalling conditions, a number of those men died, suffocated, perished in the dark on an island in the harbor in sight of the city they had spared. Now, once again, I will keep my promise to you. The exact number who died in that cell is disputed. The records are poor and were not kept by people who wanted the truth remembered, and you will see different figures in different histories. But that men died there needlessly, cruelly, after being promised their lives. That is not in dispute. The Republic had given its word, and then it murdered the men it had given its word to slowly in a cell and looked away. So take the shape of the whole thing in your two hands now and feel its awful weight. They rose against the whip. They won. They ended the lash by law. And then, for the crime of having forced the country to be a little more just, they were destroyed. The victory was real, and the betrayal was total. Both true, both at once. That is not the tidy story the schoolbook likes, but it is what happened. And what of him? What of the Black Admiral Joao Candido, the calm man who had held 10,000 furious hearts steady and asked only for an end to the whip? He survived the cell on Snake Island, one of the ones who did not die in that dark. But his ordeal was far from over. He was held, he was tried, accused now of crimes against the state he had, in truth, handled with more mercy than it ever showed him. And in 1912, in a court of law, Joao Candido was acquitted, found not guilty. The law, in the end, could not honestly convict him. But acquittal is not the same as justice, and it is certainly not the same as gratitude. The Navy would never take him back. The man who had commanded the most powerful fleet in South America was cast out to live the rest of his long life as a poor man. He worked as best he could. For a time, they say, he sold fish at a market stall in Rio, at the edge of the very bay where he had once turned the guns of battleships. The Black Admiral, selling fish. He lived quietly and modestly, and largely forgotten by the official story of his country for decades. He did not die until 1969, an old man, having outlived nearly everyone who had tried to erase him. 59 years he carried it, and erase him they did try. For a long, long time, the Revolt of the Lash was not a proud chapter in the Brazilian schoolbook. It was an embarrassment the powerful preferred to forget, a moment when the bottom of society had held a knife to the throat of the top and been proven, morally, entirely in the right. That is not a story the comfortable enjoy telling their children. So for generations, Joao Candido was pushed to the margins, a footnote, a name most Brazilians could not have placed. But you cannot bury a man like that forever. The truth has a way of surfacing, often through the back door, often through art when the front door of the history book is locked. And here is the detail I always end this lesson on, because it is beautiful, and because it shows you how a nation slowly remembers what it tried to forget. In the 1970s, Brazil was living under a military dictatorship, an era when speaking too plainly about power and rebellion could put you in a cell of your own. And in that difficult time, two artists, João Bosco and Aldir Blanc, wrote a song. A gorgeous, aching, poetic song, and they wrote it in a way for him, for the Black Admiral. It was called O Mestre Sala das Mares, which you might turn into English as something like the Master of Ceremonies of the Seas, or the Dancing Master of the Seas. Because the censors were watching, they could not simply say what they meant. They had to wrap the tribute in poetry, sing about a black hero of the water without saying the dangerous names out loud. And under that cloak, the song honored Joao Candido and what his sailors had done, and it carried his memory, quietly, back into the heart of the Brazilian people, in a time when saying it straight was forbidden. A hero forced to hide inside a song, because the country still was not brave enough to speak his name plainly. There is the whole tragedy in a single image, and there, too, is the beginning of the healing. Little by little, over the years since, the revolt of the Lash has come back into the light. Joao Candido has slowly taken a place he was denied for so long, honored now in monuments and in books, and in the memory of a people finally ready to look at what was done. Late, far too late for him to see much of it, but it came. So, let me gather this up the way I always did at the end of the lesson when the room had gone very quiet, because there is a thing in here I want you to carry out with you, and it is not really about ships. For years my students wanted at this point to know the villain. Who was the bad man, Professor? Point him out so we can hate him properly. And I always found I could not give them a single face to hate, and that the wanting of one was itself the thing to notice. Because the cruelty in this story was not really one evil man. It was a whole society that had written down in law that all its people were free and equal, and had gone on, in its daily habits, in its casual arrangements, in the reach of its own hand toward a whip, treating some of those people as though the words on the paper did not apply to them at all. Brazil abolished slavery on paper in 1888, and then it kept the whip, and it took poor, black, ordinary men with nothing, risking everything, aiming the nation's own guns at the nation's own heart, to force the country to make its actions match its words. Just a little, just about the whip, and even that it punished them for. And here is where I turn it, gently, toward you, because I did not walk you through all this suffering to leave you with a date and a shudder. Every country, every society, every one of us, carries this same gap, the space between the fine things we have written down about who we are, and the smaller, harder truth of how we actually treat the people with the least power to object. It is easy to sign the law. It is easy to say the noble words. The whole weight of this story sits in the distance between the saying and the doing, and in the uncomfortable fact that closing that distance, even by an inch, almost never comes as a gift from the powerful. It gets forced by people at the very bottom with the most to lose, who decide one night that they would rather risk everything than count one more stroke of the whip in silence. So the question this story leaves on the table in front of you, and I want you to actually feel its weight, because I do, every single time, is not who was the villain. It is quieter and harder than that. Where, right now, in your own world, is the gap between what is written down and what is actually done? And who is standing in that gap, being counted through in silence, waiting for someone to decide they will not simply watch? I genuinely want to know what you think, and I read the comments, so do me the honor of telling me two things down below. First, before today, had you ever heard of Joao Candido, the Black Admiral, or of the Revolt of the Lash? Be honest. I already suspect the answer, and I want to know just how deep this forgetting runs beyond my own country. And second, the harder one. Think of a moment in your own nation's history, or even in your own life, where the fine words on the paper and the real treatment of the powerless did not match, and where someone, at some cost, forced them a little closer together. Tell me their name. Let us remember a few of them together. And if you had never heard this story, if the man who aimed battleships at a capital city to end the whip, and won, and was betrayed for it, was a stranger to you until tonight, then do me one small kindness and subscribe, because there is a whole country full of buried people like Joao Candido, brave and inconvenient and left out of the schoolbook on purpose, and I intend to dig up every last one of them and set them back in the light where they belong. My name is Joaquim. Thank you for pulling up a chair. And the next time someone tells you that the powerless can change nothing, remember a helmsman with a whipped back, standing calm on a stolen battleship, forcing an empire of habit to blink.